Good morning. I want to thank Molly for her presentation. I sure learned a lot. I'm sure we all did. And I also want to just add, before I dive into this, that a little bit about me personally. I come from a family of scientists. I went to college to be a scientist, and then somehow I went off into religion and ethics. But you'll hear some of that in what I have to say. In addition to my book being downstairs, I just wanted to draw your attention to an excellent book that has literally just come out this week, Rooted and Rising. It's edited by Margaret Bullitt Jonas and Leah Schad. I have an essay in here which echoes some of what I will be saying to you today. Molly started out with kind of a big picture of the sort of mess we're in. I just want to give a couple of bullet points about that. That drought is now measured in decades, not years. That rainfall from big storms is now measured in feet, not inches. In August 2019, Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas was, and I'm quoting now, the longest siege of violent, destructive weather ever observed. Since 1950, the number of floods in the world has increased by 15 times. Extreme temperature events by 20 times, and wildfires by 7-fold. Persistent high temperatures are wreaking havoc with our forests. Fire season, on average in the United States, is 78 days longer. In California, it's 365 days a year. And today, Pacific Gas and Electric is likely going to shut off electricity for the next 48 hours to about 50% of California because of the concern for those electrical connections starting fires. Temperatures, of course, would be a lot hotter if it weren't for the oceans. Oceans absorb over 93% of the heat created by global warming. And we've just learned that the oceans are warming 40% faster than we thought only 5 years ago. And as they absorb the CO2, the oceans become more acidic at a frightening rate, in excess of what the world has seen in 300 million years. On a larger scale, the Earth's temperature is already well into the range that existed during the Eemian period 120,000 years ago, when sea levels were between 20 and 30 feet higher. And finally, there are about 10 million plant and animal species in the world, and 1 million of them are now at risk of extinction. So truly, we are in the midst of an unprecedented emergency. Let me just put these down over here. So now what I want to do is to identify 5 broad ethical concerns that will help you understand why people of faith must engage this challenge. Many fail to understand the first broad ethical concern, that climate change is an injustice multiplier and accelerator. Climate change multiplies and accelerates injustice in at least 3 ways. First, the first injustice is that climate change is hitting the poorest people and people of color first and worst. It's the poorest people who live in areas most likely to flood, most prone to disease, most subject to droughts, heat waves, and various diseases that are now migrating north due to climate change. And here in America, our inner cities have a health crisis that gets worse each summer. As temperatures rise, more and more cases of asthma are disabling and killing children and elderly people of color. The second injustice is that those most affected by climate change did not cause it and are powerless to stop it. For example, farmers in parts of Africa are losing their lands either due to droughts or to unprecedented flooding, and these farmers have a carbon footprint 1/200th the carbon footprint of the average American. The third injustice is that people in institutions who actually caused and are causing climate change are not paying the reparations for the catastrophic damage it's already causing. And not only that, but here in the US, we actually subsidize fossil fuel companies to the tune of $25 billion a year. That's in the US alone. So whatever injustice issue concerns you most, and churches typically have committees on homelessness and on food, et cetera, climate change is making those injustices worse. That's why we regard climate change as that's why we cannot regard climate change as just one justice issue among many. It accelerates and magnifies all the justice issues. The second broad ethical concern associated with climate change is humanity's inadequate focus on and acceptance of intergenerational responsibility. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of you have heard from your clergy person a sermon on intergenerational responsibility, but I would suggest we should be hearing them every month. We'll come to that in a moment. And I'll say more about this in a moment. A third broad ethical concern is associated with climate change. Focuses on our relationship to and our attitude toward nature. Going and listening to David Bollier would be, I would highly recommend it. Nobody is as good as him in talking about our attitude toward nature. With the exception of indigenous cultures, humanity regards nature as a treasure trove for exploitation. To me, and I'll echo Bollier a little bit when I say this, it is unthinkable that the world's religions have developed over the past several eons in a way that seems to be okay with the notion of owning nature. If you're interested, I'd be glad to go back and forth on that in Q&A. A fourth broad ethical concern raised by climate change is the need for a new understanding of fiduciary accountability. So if you yourself are in some ways involved with money, investing, etc., or if people in your church are, listen up to what I'm about to say. As people of faith, it's our forebears in the faith who introduced the notion of fiduciary and fiduciary responsibility. That's what the word means, to keep faith. The current understanding of fiduciary allows the directors of companies to claim the moral and legal high ground when all they do is maximize short-term monetary profit for their shareholders. For centuries, the church has ceded to the legal and the investment world the exclusive right to interpret society's understanding of fiduciary responsibility. I believe it's both crazy and criminal to think that an investment advisor has satisfied his or her fiduciary obligation by assuring maximum profit over the next quarter while ignoring the fact that that investment will wreck the home of the investor, the home being Earth. So I'm not alone in this view. As I discussed in my book, former Securities and Exchange Commissioner Beavis Longstreet, who gets the award for best name, Beavis Longstreet. He was a Reagan appointee. He served for three terms on the Securities and Exchange Commission. He agrees completely, and you can read more from him on the web. A fifth broad ethical issue is the short-term time horizon that dominates both investment practices and the political agenda. Humanity needs to follow moral principles that take seriously the fact that for the past many decades, we have acted in ways that have consequences for eons to come, just as our previous speaker was pointing out. So now I want to focus just for a few minutes on vocation, a religious concept that is more broad than the more narrow use in religion. In a time such as this, and what I'm referring to there is from the book of Esther, chapter 4. It's a great story if you want some biblical backing for what I'm about to say. In a time such as this, I want to ask you to ponder your own personal calling. I want to ask you to ponder what is the calling of your faith community in a time such as this. It can't be that churches, synagogues, and mosques essentially have the same calling today as they had 50 years ago. That can't be. And that's because for the previous 6,000 years during which religion in a organized way has existed, we had continuity of creation. That's gone. And therefore, religion needs to find a new vocation. If that sounds like a big deal and something that people in this room might bring back home to their communities of faith, you're hearing me correctly. And then I want to argue as well that humanity itself now has a vocation. And the comparison I would make is with the World War II greatest generation. I'll say more about that in a second. So the most frequent questions I get after my talks are, what can I do as one person? Or what can my congregation do? And that would really make a difference. And as it turns out, we've been born into this time with what is really the greatest opportunity humanity has ever had. And that's what I want to address and what I have to say in what follows. But to engage that opportunity, what we need to do is to really embrace a new vocation and stop continuing to live our lives in terms of business as usual. So what are the characteristics of this new vocation? Courage. Courage is the first quality. It's no longer optional. Courage is required. Serving as a denominational leader in a time of profound systemic injustice and increasing discontinuity, I'm convinced that God is calling people of faith to speak with a clear, bold, truthful, and prophetic voice in a time of climate crisis. Urgency is the second quality. And no one communicates urgency better than 16-year-old Greta Thunberg. She's focused on climate change since she was 8 years old. In August 2018, she embraced a new vocation. Think of it that way. She's a 15-year-old, right, who is autistic. And instead of going to school, she goes out with her sign in front of the Parliament for a day. That's a new vocation. That's the frame I want you to look at Greta with, okay? And she did it completely in isolation. She was totally alone until a few months later, she had 10,000 fellow school strikers from Scandinavia with her. And then she was asked to give a TED Talk as a 15-year-old, are you kidding me? In November. And this is what she said: we wouldn't be talking about anything else if we took climate change seriously. As soon as you would turn on the TV, everything would be about it. Headlines, radio, newspaper. You'd never read anything else, as if a world war was going on. So then in March, she spoke to the richest people in the world in Davos, Switzerland. Now, Greta doesn't fly, so she took the ferry over to the mainland. She had a 33-hour train ride. Toward the end of that train ride, when she was in Switzerland, she went past a dozen or a score of private airports, each of which had 200 or 300 private jets from the people who were convening in Davos. You all with me on this? Yeah. She gets off the train, she walks in, she's the honored guest. So the host of the conference says, oh, we have a suite of rooms for you. She says, no thanks, I brought my tent. She sleeps outside in the freezing cold, and when she has her opportunity, she says this: we must change almost everything in our current societies. The bigger your carbon footprint, the bigger your moral duty. The bigger your platform, the bigger your responsibility. I don't want your hope. I want you to act every single day as if you were in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house were on fire, because it is. Her unrelenting focus and undiluted truthfulness has inspired millions. On September 18th, she offered our House Ways and Means Committee her I Have a Dream speech. I have a dream that people in power, as well as the media, start treating this crisis like the existential emergency it is. In fact, I have many dreams, but this is 2019. It's not the time and place for dreams. This is the time to wake up. And yet, wherever I go, I seem to be surrounded by fairy tales. Elected officials make up bedtime stories to soothe us. That makes us go back to sleep. The problem is we need to wake up. It's time to face the reality, the facts, the science. This is above all an emergency, and not just any emergency, it's the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced, and we need to react accordingly. And then a couple of weeks ago, she told the leaders of the world at the UN General Assembly, "You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? How dare you pretend that this problem can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions?" But young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you. We will not let you get away with this right here, right now. This is where we draw the line. The world is waking up, and change is coming, whether you like it or not. So the challenge of climate change is no less a challenge than when we as a country faced fascism. And so I want to share with you a little story about that. In 1939, if FDR had gone to Edsel Ford and said, "Edsel, listen, I want you to build the biggest manufacturing complex the world has ever seen, and I want you to complete it within 6 months. And then I want you to make, inside that manufacturing complex, something you've never made before, something you have no expertise in. And I want you to churn out one of those things every 24 hours. Do you think you could do that for me, Edsel?" If FDR had said that to Edsel Ford in 1939, he would have said, "Mr. President, you are out of your mind." But in 1941, everything had changed. And when FDR said it to Edsel Ford 6 months later, the Willow Run manufacturing complex was completed, and every 24 hours, a B-24 Liberation bomber rolled off the assembly line. And that bomber had 1.2 million parts. So if the alarm of World War II can prompt the largest industry in America to willingly and urgently redirect its resources and change its business plan, right? Then it's up to our generation to muster the courage that climate change requires of us to create a new story. A story so powerful that we can hasten the day when every human heart is governed not by grief, but by hope, not by constraint, but by generosity, not by selfishness, but by sharing. So if courage and urgency are the first two qualities we must embrace, the third is scale. The scale today that we need is enormous, and so are the solutions that are available today. The Green New Deal demonstrates all three of these qualities: courage, urgency, and scale. It does so by creating abundant, clean energy jobs with a more just economy. That's why a few months ago, the United Church of Christ became the first Christian denomination in America to endorse the Green New Deal. If you want to learn more about that, I'll be doing a workshop on that immediately following this session. And let's remember why a future without fossil fuels is even possible. I like to call it the original Green New Deal, which is the amount of sunlight and wind energy that we have available to us 24/7 around the clock, around the world. So keeping in mind these qualities of courage and urgency and scale, let me just suggest several themes of this new story that God is calling us to create. The first theme is to make our houses of worship safe enough and relevant enough that we can do three things. First, we can talk about climate change as part of every time we gather as a community of faith. Second, we can hear each other's testimony. What if we added every month a 2-minute testimony to our worship services given by a member of the church who is pregnant or by that person's partner, in which that person would share a brief response to this question: in a world with a threatened future, what does it mean that we can bear and raise children? That's the kind of intimacy and candor we need to create in our houses of worship if we're going to change the world in ways that are needed now. And third, our houses of worship need to be places where we process our grief. And by doing so, we empower one another to engage the long emergency. In a time such as this, we must acknowledge that the continuity of creation, upon which thousands of generations of humans have sought moral progress, that is over. And one thing more, we must recognize that the existential dread we experience can serve as a precondition of hope. Once we have a safe enough context in which we can share our dread with trusted friends, by the grace of God, the Holy Spirit will ignite in us a tenacious and defiant hope. We also need to preach about climate change. So I invite you to challenge your clergy. We need to be hearing from the pulpit about climate change at least once a month. If we don't, I could say something more about this, but on a regular basis, when I was head of the UCC in Massachusetts, I had the authority and the privilege of convening groups of clergy. And I would tell them, if we don't start doing that, then within 10 years, all of our sermons will be on grief. And that will be the only reason we continue to connect with God, is to grieve over the home we let go. Churches need to be places where we where we organize to resist new fossil fuel infrastructure. Down in Massachusetts, there's a LNG compressor station being built or being proposed in Weymouth. It has been delayed by over 2 years by houses of worship in the Hingham-Weymouth area. That fight continues with the governor there. I've been arrested a couple of times in the governor's office trying to block that. Here's a fourth theme, and it relates to what I just said. We need to make civil disobedience a normative expression of faithfulness, every bit as much as prayer. If I were to ask all of you, geez, as people of faith, do you pray on a regular basis? Everybody here would raise their hand, right? Well, what would it be like if 5 years from now, if I were to ask, how many of you have been arrested for the sake of the earth? What would it be like if half of us raised our hand? That's the kind of pivot we need to make, friends. That's what lies ahead. I'm condensing what I have to say because I know we're under a time constraint. Congregations need to become, for those of us that are Christian, I have a biblical quote to offer, an Acts 2:42 congregation in which the common good, that we hold all things in common, is emphasized in that passage. And we need to promote that as a spiritual discipline. Again, I'd be glad to say more about that if you're interested and if we have time to talk more about it. As Molly said, we need to reevaluate the land, not just the land in the broad sense that she was speaking of, but what about the land our houses of worship are on? There are a bunch of congregations in Massachusetts that have said, oh my goodness, we just never thought that our land was like an asset. And they have converted their lands to permaculture gardens. And they have brought in community members who would never come to church, ever. But because there's a permaculture garden available there, they're now gardening on the church lawn. And they show up on Sundays every once in a while. Here's a seventh theme. I won't ask for a show of hands of how many of your congregations have examined your financial investments and made a determination to divest from fossil fuel holdings. But I know many of you have. And what I want everybody to know is that in 2012, when Bill McKibben wrote the first article on divestment, and then later in 2012, when I wrote the first resolution to divest it, and my board passed it, and a few months later our national body passed it, I'm quoting Bill when I say this, neither of us ever imagined that this would really grow into the movement it has become. Over $11 trillion of invested portfolios have purged themselves of fossil fuel stock. In 2013, when I would do seminars on this, people would say, well, I've talked to my investment advisor. He said, you can't have a balanced portfolio without fossil fuel stocks. And nowadays, every investment advisor will say, oh, absolutely, you can have a balanced portfolio. And they've all figured it out because the demand for it has been what it has been. And a final theme is that we need to leverage all of our assets and recognize that the pivot that living on the hinge of history requires of us means that it's no longer the case that we can continue to, whether they're financial assets, whether they are connections that we have, maybe we have a hotline to the governor, whatever that is, we need to call in all of our chits. This is really it. And locking arms with others to do that provides the kind of leverage that I think people of faith and faith communities have in order to make the changes that science says we must and technology says we can. So let me conclude by saying that as people of faith, we're called to face reality, to confess complicity, to grieve over losses and irreversible mistakes, and to imagine a different future, a future in which we give our lives to creating a new story, in which diverse people unite in common cause, generate defiant and undefeatable hope, persist in seeking reconciliation with all creation. And by responding to God's call in these ways, we will be embracing God's dream. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Betsy, do we have time for questions? What do you guys want to do?
About 10 minutes.
Okay. Come on. So, who has a question for Molly? That was easy.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Via Campesina? Is that part of the grassroots movement that you've been talking about?
Absolutely. And
Can you repeat the question, please?
the woman asked if I was familiar with La Via Campesina, which is the largest peasant organization in the world. It represents millions of peasant farmers around the world. And when I showed you in my presentation a picture from the Committee on World Food Security of a young woman talking, she came from La Via Campesina.
That's kind of what I thought.
Yes, a very powerful organization that's fighting for alternatives.
I think one of the things that is being open in Vermont is the work of Migrant Justice. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
Yes.
Based in Burlington, but they're helping migrant. I mean, that doesn't have, they don't influence so much the agriculture that they're in, but it's a people's movement for human rights, and they are food insecure.
They certainly are. She's saying that she is influenced by the work of Migrant Justice in Vermont, which is a group supporting the farm workers, primarily Mexicans, who are working year-round on our dairy farms and are undocumented because there's no legal documentation system for immigrants who are working year-round. And of course, cows don't take summer off and head off to the Bahamas or wherever.
Cows don't milk themselves.
No, in robotic
Working
milkers.
on that.
They do, and a lot of people are converting to robotic milkers because of issues with labor now. But for what it's worth, there's a day of action on November 2nd,
Yes.
next weekend at Hannaford's. That's the latest campaign for Migrant Justice. They fought a long campaign against Ben & Jerry's to get Ben & Jerry's to accept their fair food agreement. Migrant Justice is part of a worker-driven social responsibility network, which is a really interesting network of farm and food workers all around the country who are fighting for human rights in the workplace, the right to decent wages, good working conditions, and they are the ones who are actually doing the certification. And they go and inspect those places to make sure that they are complying with what they've committed to do. So Migrant Justice is a really good organization. The UUs have been supporting Migrant Justice quite a bit.
Could I just
Uh-huh.
include details on that?
You know what, let's give somebody else a chance to ask a question if we could.
Let's just see if we have other questions.
I'll take a question if somebody has one. Yes?
Jim, you talked about the issue of having children. When you address a group, you focus in on that. What are some of the good answers to that?
Good is such a value judgment. Because I mean, I can imagine moral answers on numerous sides, and there aren't just two sides either on this. I'll just say in response to your question that I know plenty of people under the age of 40 who have decided not to have children. I know plenty of people under the age of 40 who have children. I have 2 grandchildren. My son is, who's had kids, is 35. I think the kind of responsibility required to bring children into the world, knowing what we now know, is totally different than the responsibility that was required to bring children into the world for all previous human generations. And that being the case, if that's not a conversation that's happening in the context of our houses of worship, in which we are attempting to understand, God's advice for us in our lives, if that's not a conversation happening in those houses of worship, then what good are they? So to me, it's as profound a question as there is, and I appreciate you raising it.